The sky is a key element in landscape photography, as it can create mood and depth in your images. However, many beginners tend to overprocess the sky, making it look unnatural and fake. I know working with colors and contrast can be a difficult thing to handle. It requires a lot of time, experimentation to master and refine, especially when you're first starting out. I've been there. Hi everyone, what's going on? Welcome to my channel. I'm Andrea Livieri, and in this video I will share with you 6 mistakes people make when editing the sky and how to fix them. Most of them are about finding the right balance between too much and too little of something. So by the end of this video, you will know how to get a compelling and natural sky in your landscape images. This is for sure the most common mistake I see, which is cranking up the saturation way too much, making the colors extremely intense, quite unrealistic and almost overwhelming for the viewer. Generally speaking, as a visual principle, images or part of an image that have more saturation attract more attention. But when it's not done with purpose and consciousness, it just becomes a chaos of colors. So how to avoid making the viewer's eyes bleed? The simple approach when adjusting saturation is opting for subtle changes rather than drastic increases. Incremental adjustments allow you to enhance colors without making them look overly vibrant or unnatural. The sky in this image, for example, doesn't need many adjustments. We need to boost the saturation level a little bit of the entire image and maybe another few points of saturation just on the sky using a selection mask that targets only the sky. Another thing you need to consider is that when you increase the contrast in your images by adjusting the tone curve, the shadows and blacks, you're also increasing the saturation of your colors. So what I usually do after a substantial contrast adjustments is honing back the saturation slider, usually between -5 and -10, depending on the image. Of course, the oversaturation problem can be extended to all the areas of an image, so the same principle works for any section of a shot. Okay, once you get to the point you are happy with the results, the best advice I can give is just walk away from your image and come back to it later. This works for any type of editing you will make. Taking breaks during the editing session is a great way to refresh your eyes and avoid really bad editing decisions. By the way, if you want to take photos like this one and improve your photography, you can join me next year in one of my photography workshops in beautiful locations such as the Dolomites, Iceland, Tuscany. We still have a few spots available, so you can look below for the link to the workshops page and get more information there, and I would love for you to join us. Alright, another very common mistake is ignoring the color relationship, and that's most of the time related to a poorly adjusted white balance. The reason why the white balance is so important is because it affects the color contrast. So when you introduce a color cast to an image, you basically reduce the color definition. You lose the color separation because all the colors become, like in this case, more yellow. If I increase the warmth, you can immediately see I'm blending the blue sky with the yellow tones here on the horizon, so they blend together instead of standing out. And I'm gonna lose color depth and separation. You actually make the colors more similar. Here's another example with a wonderful colorful sky with many different shades. If I push the white balance too far towards one or the other direction, I lose color separation. I lose all these beautiful cold color variations that make the sky so special. So you want to try and find a sweet spot where all the colors harmonize. I typically adjust the white balance and tint sliders, moving them back and forth until I land in the ballpark where all the colors align. Remember, when you add any color cast, it becomes more noticeable each time you boost the contrast. So it's crucial to pay attention to adjusting the white balance and tint. When you have white clouds, for example, they are also a good reference to use as a natural tone. A really simple trick I use to adjust the white balance when there is not an obvious neutral point is to max out the vibrance slider at 100%, so I can better see if there is any sort of color cast. And from here, I tweak the white balance and tint slider until I find the value that gives me the best color separation. And once I'm happy with the results, I reset the vibrance slider back to 0, and now I have a balanced, neutral starting point for my color. Another very common mistake is a poor masking transition between the sky and the elements in the background or foreground. Almost any software in the market nowadays has some sort of AI tool to create a selection of the sky. The problem is, even though the AI algorithms are getting better and smarter, in many cases the results are way far to be perfect. So when you use an AI tool like Sky Selection in Lightroom or any other software, 9 out of 10 it usually requires some extra fine adjustments. One common problem with these tools is that they struggle a bit with areas where the sky meets other things. Especially when things gets a bit hazy or there is some overlap, the results might look a little strange. The technique I use to create a more organic and seamless transition is using the Sky Selection tool in conjunction with the Gradient tool. Let me show you. I'm gonna click Select Sky and Lightroom creates this mask. It's not perfect. In fact, if we heavily reduce the exposure, we can see that there are some areas not affected by the adjustments. We don't have a nice and natural fall off, and it looks fake. To address this problem is very simple. You need to use the intersect function, which allows you to modify the mask combining intersecting the two masking selections. In this case, we want to combine the sky selection we have already active with a linear gradient to create a soft transition in the sky from top to bottom. So I'm gonna go up here over these dots, right click, intersect mask with and select linear gradient. Now I'm gonna click over here on the top of the frame and drag a gradient down that will perfectly control the transitional area we want to improve. Now, if we have a look at the before and after, we get a much more natural transition up here in the sky, and it doesn't present any weird hard edges in the background area. One of the things that landscape photographers usually avoid is having overexposed highlights, but sometimes it's acceptable to have a small area of the image that is very bright. For example, I don't mind if the sun is blown out. It's actually how it should be. So the problem is that a lot of beginners try to bring back highlights for everything, including the sun, and the result is that the highlights look dull and gray. In this image I shot into the sun, and it's totally fine having the sun blown out. But if I try to recover these bright areas by pulling down the highlights, I'm gonna get a horrible result that looks absolutely awful. I'm pretty sure you have already experienced something like this at some point. So whenever you get this kind of dark muddy ring around the sun, that's a clear sign you have brought down the highlights way too far. What we can do instead is to try to recover the highlights just a little bit in the area around the bright sun to make the effect less on your face. My rule of thumb is to bring down the highlights slider until I start to see the hard edges, and that's a natural ring around the sun. Then I pull it back a notch, and that's usually the right amount needed. A quick tip to gain back more details is trying to change the color profile. So if you go up here and click over this icon, you can select a different profile, and for this image I want to select Provia, which is one of my favorite Fujifilm simulations for landscape. As you can see, I immediately recovered some details in this area around the sun. For people who don't use Fujifilm cameras, you can select Adobe Standard, which also gives you great results. They both provide more flexibility in terms of dynamic range. Of course, by changing the color profile, you have a color shift, so be aware of that and make sure it fits your vision for the image. One last tip, I also like to apply an additional small gradient filter right over the sun with a low amount of negative dehaze, just to smooth out any edges and give the highlights a soft glow. Mistake number 5. This is probably one of the most difficult things to master, and sometimes I struggle with getting it properly done. RAW developers like Lightroom or Capture One gives us a tremendous amount of tools to control contrast at different levels and make those skies really impressive and three-dimensional. The reality is that you need to use them very carefully, otherwise it's almost guaranteed you will end up with a sky that looks overprocessed and unnatural. Let's take this image as an example. The sky is a bit too bright and I want to introduce some contrast to give it more dimensionality. I've already selected the sky using the same technique I showed you before with the Select Sky AI tool. Just for the sake of the demonstration, I'm gonna crank the contrast slider up. I'm gonna also take the clarity slider all the way up to 100. Clarity works similarly to contrast, but instead of affecting highlights and shadows, it targets the midtones. Anyway, as you can see, we just killed the mood of the image. The sky is now too dark, too contrasty, the saturation went to the roof, and it doesn't match the foreground anymore. It looks off. In general, the clarity effect tends to be very aggressive. It increases the contrast of an edge over a few pixels in thickness, and this is what gives this crunchy and over-edited look. So be subtle with these contrast control sliders. Clarity-wise, a subtle increase can enhance almost any image. Usually you'll be fine when in the range between 5 to 20, depending on the image. Since an increase in contrast affects the intensity of the colors, always make sure to dial the saturation back just a tad to compensate. Something I always suggest is to create a virtual copy of the same edit where you use a lower or higher level of contrast and compare the two side by side to see which one works best. I find this technique very effective to always make the right choice. The last mistake of the list that I see very often is Noisey Skies. So why do you end up with the Noisey Skies? There are a few settings that are frequently overlooked. In the detail panel, Lightroom has some default settings that are not helping you. When you use the default settings, Lightroom sharpens the whole image and enhances even the finest variation in your picture. This means that any slight noise that you normally wouldn't notice become more visible. So let's take a look at how we can change our settings to avoid these Noisey Skies. On the detail panel, if you look here for sharpening, the amount is at 40, which is the default setting Lightroom applies during the import. So the default value is not 0. Below that, there is a setting called masking, and it's 0 by default. This means that Lightroom sharpens everything in your photo, even the smallest detail. But if you increase the masking value, Lightroom will only sharpen the areas that have a big difference in brightness, like the edges of the mountains and the sky. These are the areas that need more sharpness. So what we want to do is to get the masking value high enough to ignore the noise. I navigate to the masking slider, hold down the option key, and then I'm going to click masking while keeping the option key pressed. Now it's showing me the mask that's being used. In a mask, any white area indicates where something will be applied. In this case, our goal is to mask out the sharpening. As I increase the slider, any area turning black will not be sharpened because in a mask, black means hiding the applied effect. So I'm gonna raise my masking until the majority of the sky turns black, right about there. Now it looks much better and cleaner without any visible noise. We are selectively applying sharpening only to the white areas of the mask, effectively excluding the sky. Sometimes only these adjustments might not be enough, so the trick I use is creating a selection of the sky. Now I'm gonna select it, and under the detail panel here we have a slider called noise. All I need to do is bring this slider up higher until the sky becomes smooth with no noise. To be honest, I'm not sure if you can see the difference because of video compression on YouTube. Anyway, this is a nice trick to refine the sky cleaning if you find it still a bit too noisy. You just have to be careful, don't make it too smooth that it just doesn't fit in with the rest of the image, because the rest of the image is still going to have some noise. Photo editing is a very personal and subjective process. There is no right or wrong way to edit your images as long as you're happy with the outcome. Let me know in the comment if you have a specific go-to technique to edit the sky in your images. I hope you got something for this tutorial. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Ciao!